When billionaire Victor Ashford screamed, "Nobody silences me," at his maid, he never imagined her response would shatter his world forever and reveal a truth that would change everything he believed about power, worth, and himself. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the marble floor of the Ashford mansion as Victor Ashford adjusted his platinum watch, a piece worth more than most people's annual salary. At 52 years old, he had built an empire that stretched across 3 continents, accumulating wealth that most could only dream of. But wealth had done something else to Victor. It had turned his heart to stone and his soul to ice. Standing on the balcony of his penthouse suite, Victor surveyed his domain like a king overlooking his kingdom. The sprawling estate below housed staff quarters, guest wings, and gardens that required an army of workers to maintain. To Victor, these people weren't human beings with dreams, struggles, and families. They were simply tools, as replaceable as the expensive furniture that decorated his cold, magnificent home. The morning sun glinted off the swimming pool where his personal trainer waited, but Victor had more pressing matters. Today marked the quarterly staff review, his favorite ritual of reminding everyone exactly who held their futures in his hands. He had perfected the art of psychological dominance, finding twisted pleasure in watching grown adults cower before his verbal assaults. "Mr. Ashford," came a trembling voice from behind him. His personal assistant, Margaret, approached with the staff evaluation files clutched against her chest like a shield. "The staff is assembled in the main hall as requested." Victor turned slowly, his cold eyes scanning Margaret's nervous face. She had worked for him for nearly a decade, yet still trembled in his presence like a frightened animal. This was exactly how he preferred it. Fear bred obedience, and obedience bred efficiency. "Excellent," Victor replied, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute power. "Today's reviews will be particularly educational." As they walked through the ornate corridors, Victor's mind wandered to his latest acquisition, a tech company he had purchased simply to shut down, eliminating competition and destroying the dreams of hundreds of employees in the process. Business was war, and Victor was a general who showed no mercy to the defeated. The main hall erupted in nervous silence as Victor entered. 37 staff members stood in perfect lines, their eyes fixed on the floor. Gardeners, housekeepers, cooks, drivers, security guards, all of them united in their shared dread of these quarterly humiliation sessions that Victor disguised as performance reviews. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victor began, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling, "today we separate the wheat from the chaff. Some of you will leave here with jobs. Others—" He let the threat hang in the air like a sword of Damocles. He began his ritual walk down the line, stopping at random to deliver cutting remarks designed to break spirits and crush confidence. The head gardener, James, received a verbal lashing for a single brown leaf Victor had noticed on a rose bush. The chef, Maria, was reduced to tears over a soup that had been served 1 degree cooler than Victor's preference. But as Victor continued his reign of terror, his eyes fell upon someone who seemed different. Standing near the end of the line was a woman he had barely noticed before, Elena Rodriguez, one of the housekeeping staff. Unlike the others, she wasn't staring at the floor. Her eyes were fixed directly ahead, and there was something in her posture that irritated him immensely. Victor had built his empire on reading people, on identifying their weaknesses and exploiting them for maximum effect. But as he studied Elena, he found himself momentarily puzzled. She showed none of the usual signs of fear or submission that he had come to expect from his staff. "You," Victor said, pointing directly at Elena, "step forward." Elena moved with quiet dignity, her steps measured and calm. She was perhaps 40 years old, with work-worn hands that spoke of years of hard labor. Her uniform was immaculate despite the physical demands of her job, and her hair was pulled back in a simple style that somehow managed to look both practical and elegant. "Elena Rodriguez," Victor read from her file, though he mispronounced her last name with deliberate disrespect. "6 months on my staff, housekeeping, unremarkable performance." He circled her like a predator, sizing up prey, searching for the crack in her armor that would allow him to break her spirit as he had broken so many others. But Elena remained still, her breathing steady, her gaze fixed on a point just over his shoulder. "Tell me, Elena," Victor said, his voice dripping with condescension, "what makes you think you deserve to continue working in my home?" For the first time, Elena's eyes shifted to meet his directly. In that moment, Victor felt something he hadn't experienced in years: uncertainty. Her eyes held a depth that suggested intelligence far beyond what her position would indicate, and more unsettling still, they held absolutely no fear. "I do my job well, Mr. Ashford," Elena replied, her voice steady and clear. "I take pride in my work, and I treat your home with the respect it deserves." The simplicity of her answer somehow felt like a challenge, though Victor couldn't quite understand why. He had expected stammering, pleading, or at the very least, the kind of obsequious flattery he was accustomed to receiving from his employees. "Pride?" Victor scoffed, raising his voice so the entire room could hear. "You take pride in cleaning toilets and scrubbing floors? How pathetically small your world must be if that represents the pinnacle of your aspirations." The cruel laughter he expected from the other staff members never came. Instead, an uncomfortable tension filled the room as everyone waited to see how this unusual confrontation would unfold. Eleanor's expression remained unchanged, but Victor thought he detected the slightest tightening around her eyes. "Honest work is nothing to be ashamed of, Mr. Ashford. Every job has dignity if it's done with integrity." The word integrity hung in the air like an accusation, and Victor felt his carefully controlled temper beginning to fray. How dare this nobody, this insignificant speck of humanity, lecture him about dignity and integrity? He was Victor Ashford, master of $1 billion empire, and he would not be challenged by a mere housekeeping employee. "Nobody silences me," Victor screamed, his face flushing with rage as he stepped closer to Elena. "Do you have any idea who you're speaking to? I could end your pathetic existence with a single phone call. I could make sure you never work anywhere in this city again." The room fell into absolute silence. Victor's outbursts were legendary, but this level of fury was rare even for him. The other staff members seemed to shrink further into themselves, terrified of becoming collateral damage in their employer's volcanic eruption. But Elena didn't flinch. She didn't step back or lower her eyes. Instead, she looked directly at Victor, with an expression that somehow managed to be both calm and profoundly sad. "Mr. Ashford," she said quietly, her voice cutting through his rage like a knife through silk, "you're absolutely right. You have the power to destroy my life, to take away my job, to make sure I never work again. But there's one thing you can't take from me." Victor's anger faltered slightly, caught off guard by her unexpected response. "And what exactly is that supposed to mean?" Elena's next words would echo in Victor's mind for the rest of his life, though in that moment he couldn't possibly understand their true significance. "You can take my job, Mr. Ashford, but you can't take my dignity. You can destroy my future, but you can't touch my soul. And you certainly can't silence the truth, that treating people with cruelty doesn't make you powerful, it makes you empty." The silence that followed was deafening. The silence that followed Elena's words was like a physical force pressing down on everyone in the room. Victor stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, his brain struggling to process what had just happened. In 30 years of building his empire, no one, absolutely no one, had ever spoken to him with such quiet defiance and emerged unscathed. The other staff members exchanged terrified glances, certain they were about to witness the complete destruction of their colleague. They had seen Victor's wrath before, had watched him reduce grown men to tears and end careers with a few well-placed phone calls. Elena had just signed her own professional death warrant, and everyone in the room knew it, but Victor remained motionless, staring at Elena as if seeing her for the first time. Her words had struck something deep within him, something he had buried so long ago that he had forgotten it existed. The concept of dignity separate from wealth, of worth that couldn't be purchased or destroyed. These were foreign concepts in Victor's carefully constructed world. "Get out!" Victor whispered, his voice barely audible. "All of you, get out!" The staff scattered like leaves in a hurricane, desperate to escape before their employer's legendary temper fully erupted. But Elena remained standing exactly where she was, her eyes still fixed on Victor's face with that same unnerving calm. "You too," Victor said, his voice slightly stronger now. "Leave. Before I do something we'll both regret." Elena nodded slowly, but before turning to go, she did something that would haunt Victor for days to come. She smiled, not with mockery or triumph, but with something that looked disturbingly like pity. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Mr. Ashford," she said softly, and then she was gone, leaving Victor alone in the vast hall, with only his thoughts and the echo of her words. For the next several hours, Victor paced his office like a caged animal. He had built his fortune on his ability to read people, to understand their motivations and exploit their weaknesses. But Elena Rodriguez had completely defied his understanding of human nature. She had nothing to gain from challenging him and everything to lose, yet she had done it anyway. Why? He found himself replaying their conversation over and over, analyzing every word, every gesture, every micro-expression. The more he thought about it, the more disturbed he became. Not because she had challenged him, he had faced down corporate sharks and government officials without breaking a sweat. No, what disturbed him was the way she had looked at him, as if she could see something he couldn't see himself. "Margaret!" Victor barked into his intercom, his assistant appearing in his doorway within seconds. "Yes, Mr. Ashford. I want a complete background check on Elena Rodriguez. Everything. Where she came from, where she worked before, family, education, financial history. I want to know what she had for breakfast 3 years ago." Margaret nodded quickly and disappeared, leaving Victor to continue his brooding. There had to be an explanation for Eleanor's behavior, some angle he was missing. Perhaps she was working for a competitor, trying to infiltrate his organization. Or maybe she was mentally unstable, explaining her complete lack of self-preservation instincts. But even as he considered these possibilities, Victor knew they didn't ring true. There had been something authentic about Elena's demeanor, something that suggested her words came from a place of genuine conviction rather than calculated manipulation. The background report arrived the next day, and Victor devoured it like a starving man consuming his first meal. But instead of providing answers, the file only deepened the mystery. Elena Rodriguez was exactly who she appeared to be, a single mother who had immigrated years earlier, working multiple jobs to support her teenage daughter. No criminal record, no connections to his competitors, no history of mental illness. She was, by all accounts, exactly what she claimed to be, an honest woman trying to make an honest living. What struck Victor most was a small detail buried in the employment history. Elena had previously worked for Grandview Manor, an exclusive assisted living facility for wealthy elderly clients. She had been dismissed after refusing to participate in what the report described as questionable billing practices. The facility had later been shut down by federal investigators for fraud. Victor leaned back in his chair, processing this information. Elena had given up a well-paying job rather than compromise her principles. She had chosen integrity over financial security, a decision that Victor found both incomprehensible and strangely admirable. For the first time in years, Victor found himself thinking about his own choices, his own compromises. When had he stopped caring about right and wrong and started caring only about winning? When had he become the kind of man who took pleasure in humiliating those who couldn't fight back? The questions tormented him for days. He found himself distracted during board meetings, unable to focus on the usual machinations of corporate warfare. His sleep was plagued by strange dreams, where Elena's words echoed endlessly, "You can't touch my soul." It was during one of these restless nights that Victor made a decision that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. He would find Elena and talk to her again, not to threaten or intimidate, but to understand. He needed to know what gave her such strength, such unshakable certainty in her own worth. The next morning, Victor did something he hadn't done in decades. He drove his own car instead of using his chauffeur. He had obtained Eleanor's address from her personnel file, though using it for non-business purposes violated several company policies. But Victor was beyond caring about policies now. He was a man obsessed with solving a puzzle that threatened to consume him. Elena lived in a modest apartment complex on the other side of the city, a world away from Victor's palatial estate. The building was old but well-maintained, with small balconies adorned with flowering plants that someone clearly tended with love and care. Victor sat in his luxury vehicle for nearly an hour, watching the building and trying to understand what he was doing there. He was Victor Ashford, master of a corporate empire, and he was stalking a housekeeping employee like some kind of deranged fan. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on him, but neither was the strange compulsion that had brought him here. As if summoned by his thoughts, Elena emerged from the building, carrying a worn but clean bag and walking with the same quiet dignity he remembered from their confrontation. She was heading toward the bus stop, presumably on her way to work, though Victor realized with a start that she no longer worked for him. Without fully conscious thought, Victor got out of his car and called her name. "Elena!" She turned, and if she was surprised to see him, she didn't show it. Instead, she waited calmly as he approached, her expression neither welcoming nor hostile. "Mr. Ashford," she said simply, "this is unexpected. I need to talk to you," Victor said, then immediately felt foolish for the desperation he heard in his own voice. Eleanor studied his face for a long moment, and Victor had the uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing things he preferred to keep hidden. Finally, she nodded toward a small cafe across the street. "I have a few minutes before my shift starts," she said. "We can talk there." The cafe was nothing like the exclusive establishments Victor usually frequented. The furniture was mismatched, the floor showed years of wear, and the menu was written on a chalkboard in slightly smudged chalk. But it was clean and welcoming, filled with the kind of genuine warmth that Victor's expensive restaurants had never managed to achieve. As they sat across from each other at a small table by the window, Victor found himself at a complete loss for words. He had built his career on his ability to dominate conversations, to control the narrative, and bend others to his will. But sitting across from Elena in this humble cafe, he felt like a child trying to communicate with an adult. "Why did you do it?" he finally asked. "Why did you risk everything just to say those things to me?" Eleanor stirred her coffee slowly, considering her answer. "Because someone needed to," she said finally. "Because you're destroying yourself, and no one around you cares enough to tell you the truth." "Destroying myself?" Victor laughed bitterly. "I'm worth more money than most small countries. I have power that kings would envy. How exactly am I destroying myself?" "When was the last time you felt genuine joy, Mr. Ashford?" Elena asked quietly. "When was the last time you did something simply because it was right, not because it would make you money or give you power? When was the last time you looked in the mirror and actually liked the person staring back at you?" The questions hit Victor like physical blows, each one exposing a wound he hadn't realized was there. He opened his mouth to give angry, dismissive answers, but found that honest responses were rising in his throat instead. Never. The answer to all of Eleanor's questions was never, or at least not in so long that he couldn't remember when. "You don't know anything about my life," Victor said, but the words lacked conviction. "I know enough," Elena replied gently. "I know that you're so afraid of being vulnerable that you've forgotten how to be human. I know that you've surrounded yourself with people who fear you instead of people who care about you. And I know that somewhere inside that armor you've built, there's still a person worth saving." Victor stared at her in amazement. Why would you care what happens to me? I was cruel to you, ready to destroy your life over nothing more than wounded pride. Eleanor smiled sadly. Because I've seen what happens when good people lose their way. My father was a good man once, before bitterness and anger consumed him. I couldn't save him, but maybe I can help you save yourself. For the first time in decades, Victor Ashford felt tears threatening to fall. Chapter 3. The unexpected revelation. The tears that threatened to fall from Victor's eyes felt like molten steel against his cheeks. He hadn't cried since he was a child, had trained himself to view emotion as weakness, vulnerability as a fatal flaw in the armor of success. Yet here he sat in a humble cafe, across from a woman he had tried to humiliate, feeling more exposed than he had ever felt in his life. Elena reached across the small table and placed her weathered hand gently over his manicured one. The contact was electric, not with romance, but with something far more profound, human connection that transcended the artificial barriers of wealth and status. "It's never too late to change, Mr. Ashford," she said softly, "but you have to want it more than you want to be right." Before Victor could respond, the cafe door chimed, and a young woman entered, scanning the room with worried eyes. She was perhaps 17, with Elena's same quiet dignity and intelligent gaze, though her school uniform and backpack marked her as a student. "Mama?" the girl called out in Spanish, then switched to English when she spotted Elena. "I've been looking everywhere for you. You missed our lunch meeting." Elena's face transformed with maternal warmth as she stood to embrace the newcomer. "Sofia, mi amor, I'm so sorry. I lost track of time." She gestured toward Victor, who was frantically wiping his eyes and trying to regain his composure. "This is Mr. Ashford. We were just having a conversation about perspectives." Sophia's eyes narrowed slightly as she took in Victor's expensive suit and obvious discomfort. "Ashford, as in Ashford Industries? The company that bought and destroyed Riverside Tech last month?" The question hit Victor like a physical blow. Riverside Tech had been one of his more ruthless acquisitions, a small but innovative company that he had purchased solely to eliminate their groundbreaking research and maintain his own market dominance. The closure had put 200 people out of work, but Victor had viewed it as simply the cost of doing business. "Sophia," Eleanor said quietly, "that's not—" "No, it's all right," Victor interrupted, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Yes, I am that Ashford, and yes, I destroyed that company." Sophia's young face hardened with an anger that reminded Victor uncomfortably of his younger self. "My best friend's father worked there. He was a software engineer with 15 years of experience. Now he's driving a taxi because no one else in the industry will hire him. You didn't just destroy a company, Mr. Ashford. You destroyed families." The accusation landed with devastating accuracy. Victor had never considered the human cost of his business decisions, had never allowed himself to think about the families torn apart by his corporate strategies. Numbers on a spreadsheet were easy to manipulate. Human suffering was something he had trained himself not to see. "Sophia, please," Elena said gently, but her daughter wasn't finished. "Do you know what Mr. Martinez told his daughter when he lost his job?" Sophia continued, her voice trembling with emotion. "He said he was sorry for not being smart enough to keep it. A brilliant man apologizing for your greed. How do you sleep at night?" Victor opened his mouth to deliver one of his standard justifications about market forces and business necessity, but the words died in his throat. Instead, he found himself looking at this passionate young woman and seeing something he had lost long ago, the ability to be outraged by injustice, to care about something beyond personal gain. "I don't," Victor admitted quietly. "Sleep well, I mean. I haven't slept well in years." The simple honesty of his admission seemed to deflate Sophia's anger slightly. She studied his face with the same penetrating gaze he had noticed in her mother, as if she could see past his expensive facade to the broken man beneath. "Sophia is graduating at the top of her class, Elena said, pride evident in her voice despite the tension of the moment. She's been accepted to several universities, but we're still working on the financial arrangements. I want to study social justice and environmental law, Sophia said, her earlier anger transforming into passionate determination. I want to help people fight against companies like yours, Mr. Ashford. I want to make sure what happened to Mr. Martinez never happens to anyone else. Victor felt something crack inside his chest. This brilliant young woman, denied opportunities because of financial constraints while he spent more on wine in a month than most families earned in a year, was dedicating her life to opposing everything he represented. The irony was crushing. What university? Victor asked suddenly. Sophia looked confused by the question. I'm sorry? Which universities accepted you? Elena placed a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder. Mr. Ashford, I don't think... Columbia, Stanford, and Berkeley, Sophia answered, lifting her chin defiantly. Not that it matters. We can't afford any of them. Victor felt his phone buzzing in his pocket, probably Margaret calling about some urgent business crisis that would have consumed his attention completely just days ago. Now, sitting across from Elena and Sophia, those crises seemed insignificant compared to the revelation forming in his mind. I need to ask you something, Victor said, addressing Elena directly. That day in my house, when you stood up to me, did you know who I was? I mean, really know what I was capable of? Elena nodded slowly. I knew exactly who you were, Mr. Ashford. I had done my research before taking the job. I knew about Riverside Tech, about the pension fund you liquidated at Morrison Manufacturing, about the environmental violations your chemical plants have been covering up for years. Victor's blood ran cold. Then why did you risk confronting me? Why would you deliberately provoke someone you knew could destroy you? Eleanor's answer came without hesitation. Because someone had to. Because every time good people stay silent in the face of cruelty, evil wins a little more. Because I would rather lose my job than lose my soul. And because, Sophia added, her voice softer now but no less determined, my mother taught me that the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. The words hit Victor with the force of a revelation. For years, he had operated in a bubble where his actions had no consequences beyond profit margins and stock prices. He had surrounded himself with people who told him what he wanted to hear, who validated his choices and enabled his worst impulses. But Elena had shattered that bubble with a single act of moral courage. There's something else you should know, Elena said quietly, glancing at her daughter before continuing. About why I really took the job at your house. Victor braced himself for another revelation, though he couldn't imagine what could be more devastating than what he had already learned. My previous employer at Grandview Manor wasn't just committing billing fraud, Elena continued. They were systematically neglecting and abusing elderly residents. When I reported it to the authorities, the owner tried to have me deported. False accusations, forged documents, the whole nightmare. Mama, Sophia said softly, clearly hearing some of these details for the first time. I fought it for months, Elena continued. Spent every penny we had saved on legal fees. We lost our apartment, had to move in with my sister's family. I took the job with you because it was the only work I could find that paid enough to support us while the investigation continued. Victor felt sick. The investigation led to criminal charges against the owner and complete reform of the facility. Dozens of elderly residents got justice because Elena refused to stay silent, Sophia said, her voice filled with pride and pain. But it cost us everything we had. Not everything, Elena corrected gently. We still had each other. We still had our principles. And we still had hope that things could get better. Victor stared at them both, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was learning. Elena hadn't just been a housekeeping employee who got lucky with a clever comeback. She was a genuine hero who had sacrificed everything to protect vulnerable people, and he had tried to humiliate her for his own amusement. I need to make this right, Victor said suddenly, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. All of it. Riverside Tech, the pension fund, the environmental violations, everything. Elena and Sophia exchanged a skeptical look. Mr. Ashford, Elena said carefully, that's a very noble sentiment, but— No, you don't understand, Victor interrupted, his mind racing with possibilities he had never considered before. I have the resources to fix this, not just financially but systemically. I could create a foundation, establish oversight committees, implement environmental reforms. And why would you do that? Sophia asked, her tone still suspicious but curious. Victor looked at both women, seeing clearly for the first time in decades the kind of people he could have become, should have become, if he hadn't lost his way so completely. Because, he said, his voice breaking slightly, you've shown me what I really am, and I don't want to be that person anymore. The silence that followed Victor's declaration stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Sophia's skeptical expression softened slightly, but her guard remained firmly in place. Eleanor watched Victor with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle, searching his face for signs of deception or manipulation. People like you don't just change overnight, Sophia said finally, her voice carrying the hard-earned wisdom of someone who had witnessed too much adult hypocrisy. You say these things now because you feel guilty. But what happens tomorrow when this guilt fades, and your board of directors starts pressuring you about quarterly profits? Victor winced at the accuracy of her assessment. How many times had he made similar promises to himself in quiet moments, only to abandon them when faced with the ruthless demands of corporate warfare? But something felt different this time. Something fundamental had shifted in the very core of his being. You're right to be suspicious, Victor admitted, pulling out his phone. Words are meaningless without action. So let me start with something concrete. His fingers moved across the screen with practiced efficiency, accessing accounts that contained more money than most people could comprehend. Sophia, you said Columbia was your first choice? I said I was accepted there, Sophia replied cautiously. I never said anything about first choice. It doesn't matter which is first, Victor continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. I'm funding your complete education at whichever university you prefer. Full tuition, room and board, living expenses, everything. Elena's hand flew to her mouth in shock, while Sophia took an involuntary step backward as if she had been physically struck. That's impossible, Sophia stammered. Do you know how much that costs? We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. Victor looked up from his phone, his eyes meeting Sophia's with an intensity that made her breath catch. I spent more than that on artwork last month. Money I can't even remember purchasing. For paintings I never look at, hanging in rooms I rarely enter. The brutal honesty of his admission hung in the air like an accusation against everything he had allowed himself to become. But Victor wasn't finished. His fingers continued their dance across the phone screen, accessing systems that controlled the fate of thousands of employees across his corporate empire. Furthermore, he continued, his voice growing stronger with each decision, I'm reinstating every employee who lost their job in the Riverside Tech closure. Full back pay, restored benefits, and guaranteed positions within my companies. Sophia's legs seemed to give out beneath her, and she sank into the nearest chair with a look of complete disbelief. Mr. Martinez, she whispered. You're talking about Mr. Martinez and all the others. 237 people, Victor confirmed, consulting data on his screen. I remember the exact number because my acquisition team was so proud of the cost savings achieved through workforce elimination. Elena finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. Victor, you can't just— This is madness. These are massive financial commitments you're making in a coffee shop based on emotion. Is it madness? Victor asked, looking directly at her. Or is it the first sane thing I've done in decades? I've spent my entire adult life making decisions based on spreadsheets and profit margins. Maybe it's time I made some decisions based on human decency. But even as he spoke these words, Victor could feel the familiar weight of his corporate responsibilities pressing down on him. Margaret would be calling soon about the Patterson merger. The board meeting was scheduled for the following week. Shareholders expected results, not charity cases and emotional gestures. As if summoned by his thoughts, his phone began ringing with Margaret's distinctive ringtone. Victor glanced at the screen, then at Elena and Sophia, then back at the screen. For 30 years he had never let a call from Margaret go unanswered. His assistant's needs had always taken priority over everything else in his life. This time, Victor declined the call. "You just ignored your assistant," Elena observed, her voice carrying a note of wonder. "I watched you for months in your house. You never ignored her calls." "A lot of things are changing," Victor replied, but immediately his phone began ringing again. This time it was David Thornton, his chief financial officer and longtime friend. Victor stared at the name flashing on his screen, knowing that David would be calling about something urgent, something that demanded immediate attention and decisive action. He declined that call too. Within seconds, the phone rang a third time. Harrison Webb, chairman of his board of directors, a man who had mentored Victor through his early corporate climbs and who expected absolute loyalty in return. Victor's finger hovered over the decline button, his corporate instincts warring with this new awareness that was spreading through his consciousness like wildfire. "Answer it," Sophia said suddenly. "Take the call." Victor looked at her in confusion. "I thought you wanted me to change." "I do," Sophia replied, her young face showing a maturity beyond her years. "But real change isn't about grand gestures in coffee shops. It's about what you do when the pressure is on, when people are watching, when it costs you something real." Elena nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. She's right. Anyone can promise change when it's easy. The question is whether you'll stick to these principles when they're tested. Victor stared at the still ringing phone, understanding that this moment represented far more than a simple business call. This was the point of no return, the moment where he would either commit fully to transformation or retreat into the comfortable patterns of his old life. He answered the call and put it on speaker. "Victor, thank God." Harrison's voice filled the small cafe with corporate urgency. "We've got a situation. The environmental groups are mobilizing against our chemical division. They're planning massive protests, threatening boycotts. We need to get ahead of this immediately." "What kind of protests?" Victor asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The usual environmental extremist nonsense. Claims about groundwater contamination, air quality violations, the standard playbook. Legal says we can tie them up in court for years, maybe decades. Public relations wants to launch a counter-campaign questioning their credibility." Victor glanced at Elena and Sophia, both of whom were listening intently to every word. He could see the disappointment already beginning to form in their eyes, the familiar resignation of people who had hoped for better but expected the worst. "Harrison," Victor said slowly, his voice carrying a weight that surprised even him. "What if they're right?" The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "I'm sorry, what did you just say? What if the environmental groups are right? What if our chemical plants really are contaminating groundwater and violating air quality standards? Victor, what's gotten into you? Even if they are right, which I'm not saying they are, this is about damage control and profit protection. We can't just admit to violations that could cost us billions in cleanup and penalties." Victor felt the familiar pull of corporate logic, the seductive appeal of protecting his empire regardless of the human cost. For a brief moment, he wavered, feeling the weight of shareholder expectations and board pressures. Then he looked at Sophia's face, at the hope and fear warring in her young eyes, and made the most important decision of his life. "Harrison, I need you to call an emergency board meeting. We're going to conduct a comprehensive environmental audit of all our facilities, and we're going to make the results public, regardless of what we find." "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious about anything in my life." The silence that followed Victor's declaration was so profound that the gentle hum of the cafe's espresso machine sounded like thunder. Harrison's breathing was audible through the phone speaker, each exhale carrying the weight of decades of corporate partnership suddenly shattered by a single sentence. "Victor," Harrison's voice finally emerged, strained and careful. "I think you need to step away from whatever situation you're in right now. Come back to the office. We need to discuss this privately." "There's nothing to discuss privately, Harrison," Victor replied, his voice gaining strength with each word. "We've been hiding behind closed doors for too long. The environmental audit happens, and the results become public record within 30 days. Do you have any idea what you're saying?" Harrison's corporate composure began cracking. "We're talking about potential liability in the billions. Shareholder lawsuits that could destroy everything we've built. Criminal charges for executives, including yourself." Sophia leaned forward, her eyes wide with a mixture of admiration and terror. She had demanded this test of Victor's resolve, but even she seemed stunned by the magnitude of what was unfolding. "Then maybe," Victor said slowly, "we deserve those consequences." The admission hung in the air like a confession at trial. Elena reached across the table and placed her hand over Victor's free one, offering silent support that somehow felt more valuable than all the corporate backing he was about to lose. "This conversation is over," Harrison snapped. "I'm calling an emergency board meeting to discuss your fitness to continue as CEO. Your recent behavior suggests you're having some kind of breakdown. We'll have you removed if necessary." "You do that, Harrison," Victor replied calmly. "But understand this, whether I'm CEO or not, the environmental audit is happening. I'm personally funding it through my private accounts if the company won't." The line went dead. Victor stared at his phone for a moment, processing the fact that he had just declared war on his own board of directors and potentially signed the death warrant for his corporate empire. "You realize what you just did?" Sophia asked quietly. "You might have just destroyed your entire company." "Maybe," Victor acknowledged, "or maybe I just saved my soul." Before anyone could respond, Victor's phone erupted with a cascade of notifications, text messages, emails, missed calls, all from board members, major shareholders, and senior executives who had clearly been contacted by Harrison within minutes of their conversation ending. Elena watched Victor's face as he scrolled through the digital avalanche of corporate panic. "Having second thoughts. Honestly, I'm terrified," Victor admitted. "I've never made a major business decision based on moral principles before. I don't even know if I remember how to operate that way." "Then why are you doing it?" Sophia pressed. Victor set his phone face down on the table, deliberately shutting out the corporate chaos demanding his attention. "Because this morning I woke up as a man who could buy anything but couldn't respect himself. Tonight I might go to sleep as someone who lost everything but found his integrity." The cafe door chimed again, and Margaret burst through, her usually composed demeanor completely shattered. She spotted Victor immediately and rushed to their table, her professional facade cracking with every step. "Mr. Ashford, thank God I found you," she gasped, slightly out of breath. "The board is in complete chaos. Harrison is calling for an emergency vote of no confidence. The stock price is already dropping based on rumors. You need to come back immediately and fix this." Victor studied his assistant's panicked face, remembering all the times she had enabled his worst corporate decisions without question. "Margaret, I want you to do something for me. Anything, Mr. Ashford. Just tell me how to fix this crisis. I want you to think about the last time you felt proud of something we accomplished at the company. Not financially proud, morally proud. When was the last time you went home and told your family about work because you were genuinely excited about the good we had done?" Margaret's mouth opened and closed several times, her expression shifting from confusion to something that looked almost like grief. I don't... Mr. Ashford, we run a business, not a charity." "That's what I thought too," Victor replied gently. "But what if we're wrong? What if there's a way to be successful and decent at the same time? The shareholders won't understand, Margaret said desperately. They invested in profits, not principles. Elena spoke for the first time since the phone call began. Margaret, do you have children? Yes, 2 daughters, Margaret answered, looking confused by the question. What do you want them to think when they learn about your career? Do you want them to be proud of how you spent your working life, or just impressed by how much money you made? The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her carefully maintained professional composure finally crumbled completely, and she sank into an empty chair at their table. I used to want to be a teacher, Margaret whispered. Before I got seduced by corporate salaries and executive prestige, I haven't thought about that dream in 20 years. Victor felt another piece of his old world crumbling, but instead of panic, he experienced something unexpected. Relief. It's not too late, Margaret, for any of us. His phone buzzed with an incoming call from David Thornton, his CFO. Victor glanced at the screen, then at the 3 women surrounding him. Elena with her unshakable moral courage, Sophia with her passionate idealism, and Margaret with her rediscovered humanity. David, Victor answered, putting the call on speaker once again. Victor, I've been running numbers since Harrison's call. David's voice was tight with stress. If we proceed with this environmental audit and disclosure plan, we're looking at potential cleanup costs of $2 to $3 billion. The company might not survive. And if we don't proceed, Victor asked, we continue operating as we have been. The environmental groups can protest all they want, but our legal team can keep any serious challenges tied up in court for years. While people get sick from contaminated water, Sophia interjected, her voice carrying a moral authority that seemed to fill the small cafe. Who was that? David demanded. Someone with a clearer understanding of right and wrong than either of us, Victor replied. David, I need you to understand something. The company might not survive the audit, but it definitely won't survive as something I can be proud of if we continue hiding these violations. Pride doesn't pay salaries, Victor. Pride doesn't fund pension accounts or maintain health insurance for our employees. The argument hit Victor harder than he expected. David was right. His moral awakening could cost thousands of innocent employees their livelihoods. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on him like a physical force. There's another option, Elena said quietly, her voice cutting through Victor's internal struggle. What if the company not only survives the cleanup, but becomes stronger because of it? That's impossible. David's voice carried years of corporate cynicism. Environmental compliance is a cost center, not a profit driver. Is it? Elena asked. Or is that just what you've been telling yourselves? What if environmental responsibility became your competitive advantage? What if transparency and ethical operation attracted customers who are tired of supporting companies that poison their communities? Sophia nodded enthusiastically. My generation cares more about corporate responsibility than any generation before us. We research companies before we buy products. We choose employers based on values, not just salaries. Victor felt something stirring in his mind. Not the familiar thrill of a profitable scheme, but something entirely new. A vision of business as a force for positive change rather than mere wealth accumulation. David, Victor said slowly, what if we didn't just clean up our environmental violations? What if we became the first major corporation to voluntarily exceed all environmental standards? What if we turned transparency into our brand? You're talking about a complete corporate transformation, David replied, his voice carrying a mixture of terror and intrigue. The risks would be enormous. So would the potential rewards, Victor countered, and more importantly, we'd be able to look our children in the eye without shame. The silence that followed was different from the previous pauses in their conversation. This wasn't the silence of shock or anger, but of genuine consideration. Victor could almost hear David's analytical mind working through possibilities that had never existed in their previous corporate worldview. I'd need to run completely new models, David said finally. This would require rethinking everything from our supply chain to our marketing strategy. Then start running those models, Victor replied. And David, thank you for not hanging up on me. After ending the call, Victor looked around the table at the three women who had inadvertently become his advisors in the most important business decision of his life. So, he said, managing a smile despite the magnitude of what lay ahead, anyone know how to completely transform a multinational corporation while avoiding bankruptcy and criminal prosecution? For the first time since entering the cafe, Sophia laughed, a sound of pure hope that seemed to promise that maybe, just maybe, impossible things could become possible when good people decided to risk everything for what was right. The following morning arrived like a storm front, bringing with it a tsunami of corporate warfare that threatened to destroy everything Victor had built over 3 decades. By 6 a.m., his phone had accumulated over 200 missed calls. His email inbox had crashed twice from the volume of urgent messages, and news vans were already positioning themselves outside Ashford Industries headquarters like vultures circling wounded prey. Victor stood in his penthouse office, watching the media circus unfold 40 floors below, feeling strangely calm amidst the chaos he had unleashed. Margaret entered without knocking, her usual professional composure replaced by barely controlled panic. "The board meeting has been moved up to 9 a.m., she announced, her voice strained. "Harrison called every major shareholder overnight. They're demanding your immediate resignation, and several are threatening to sue you personally for breach of fiduciary duty." "And the environmental audit team?" Victor asked, his gaze still fixed on the street below, where protesters had begun gathering alongside the news crews. Dr. Sarah Chen from Environmental Solutions International agreed to lead the investigation. "She's the most respected independent auditor in the field, but—" Margaret hesitated. "But what?" "She warned me that if the violations are as extensive as the preliminary reports suggest, the cleanup costs could bankrupt the company, and that's assuming we avoid criminal prosecution." Victor turned from the window, studying Margaret's face. "Are you having second thoughts about supporting this decision?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her hands fidgeting with the tablet that contained her daily schedule of corporate crises. "My youngest daughter asked me last night what I do at work. I realized I couldn't give her an answer that would make her proud of me." Before Victor could respond, the office doors burst open. Harrison Webb strode in, flanked by 3 other board members and the company's head of legal affairs. Their faces carried the grim determination of an execution squad. "Victor, this madness ends now," Harrison declared without preamble. "The board has votes to remove you as CEO effective immediately. You'll retain your shareholding, but all operational authority transfers to David as interim chief executive." "Nay, where is David?" Victor asked, noticing his CFO's absence from the corporate intervention. "Apparently running financial models for your insane environmental transformation plan," replied board member Patricia Sterling, her voice dripping with disgust. "He's lost his mind too." "Or maybe he's found his conscience," Victor suggested calmly. "Conscience doesn't pay dividends," snapped legal counsel Robert Hayes. "Victor, I need you to understand the legal exposure you've created. By publicly committing to environmental disclosure, you've essentially admitted to violations that could result in federal criminal charges. The Department of Justice could launch investigations that destroy not just the company, but your personal freedom." The threat hung in the air like poison gas, but Victor found himself thinking not about prison cells or financial ruin, but about Sophia's passionate declaration that she wanted to fight companies like his, about Elena's quiet courage in the face of powerful adversaries, about the families destroyed by his Riverside Tech acquisition. "Robert," Victor said quietly, "what's the worst-case scenario if we proceed with full environmental disclosure and remediation? Criminal prosecution, personal bankruptcy, complete destruction of shareholder value, and civil lawsuits that could continue for decades," Robert replied without hesitation. "And what's the worst-case scenario if we continue hiding environmental violations?" We maintain plausible deniability, protect shareholder interests, and preserve the company's market position, Robert answered, confusion evident in his voice. That's not what I asked, Victor pressed. What happens to the people living near our chemical plants? What happens to the communities drinking contaminated groundwater? What happens to the children breathing polluted air? Harrison's face flushed with frustration. Those aren't our concerns, Victor. Our fiduciary duty is to shareholders, not to random people who happen to live near our facilities. Random people, Victor repeated slowly, the phrase settling in his mind like acid. Is that really how we see them? As random people whose suffering is acceptable collateral damage for our profit margins? Patricia Sterling stepped forward, her voice taking on the tone of someone addressing a confused child. Victor, you're having some kind of emotional breakdown. This guilt you're experiencing over normal business operations isn't healthy. You need professional help, not a platform to destroy everything we've built. Maybe destroying what we've built is exactly what needs to happen, Victor replied, his voice gaining strength. Maybe we've built something that should never have existed in the first place. The board members exchanged alarmed glances, their worst fears confirmed. Victor had clearly crossed the line from corporate leader to dangerous idealist, and immediate action was required to prevent total catastrophe. The vote is 13-2 in favor of your removal, Harrison announced. Security will escort you from the building within the hour. Any attempt to interfere with company operations will result in legal action. As if summoned by Harrison's words, the office doors opened again. But instead of security guards, David Thornton entered, carrying a thick folder of documents and wearing an expression Victor had never seen before, something that looked remarkably like hope. Before you execute this coup, David said, addressing the room, you might want to see what I've discovered. He spread financial projections across Victor's conference table, documents covered with charts and numbers that made several board members lean forward despite themselves. I've been running models all night, exploring Victor's environmental transformation concept, David continued. The initial cleanup costs would indeed be enormous, nearly $3 billion over 5 years. The company would face significant financial strain. Harrison smiled triumphantly. Thank you, David. Your analysis confirms what we already knew. Victor's plan is financial suicide. I wasn't finished, David said sharply. Yes, the cleanup costs are massive, but the potential revenue streams from environmental leadership are even larger. He pointed to a series of projections that showed revenue growth curves extending far beyond anything the company had previously achieved. Environmental responsibility is becoming the primary purchasing criteria for consumers under 35, David explained. Companies that demonstrate genuine environmental leadership are capturing market share at unprecedented rates. If we become the first major corporation to voluntarily exceed all environmental standards, we don't just avoid liability, we become the preferred choice for an entire generation of consumers. Patricia Sterling studied the documents with obvious skepticism. These projections assume consumer behavior that has never been tested at this scale. Actually, they assume consumer behavior that's already happening, Sophia's voice said from the doorway. Everyone turned to see Elena and Sophia standing at the entrance to the office, having somehow bypassed building security. Elena carried herself with quiet dignity, but Sophia radiated the passionate energy of someone who had something important to say. "How did you get in here?" Harrison demanded. "I invited them," Victor said, though he was as surprised as anyone by their appearance. Sophia stepped forward, ignoring the hostile stares from the board members. "You want to know about consumer behavior? My entire generation researches companies before we buy anything. We choose employers based on environmental practices. We invest our money in funds that exclude corporations with poor environmental records." "You're teenagers," Patricia dismissed. "You don't control significant purchasing power. We're the largest generation in history, and we are entering our peak earning years. Sophia replied calmly. And unlike previous generations, we're willing to pay premium prices for products from companies that align with our values. Elena spoke for the first time since entering. My daughter represents the future of your customer base. You can either evolve to meet their expectations, or you can become obsolete, while companies that embrace change capture your market share. The room fell silent as the board members processed this unexpected perspective. David seized the moment to elaborate on his projections. Environmental leadership wouldn't just attract new customers. It would qualify us for massive government contracts that are increasingly requiring environmental compliance. It would reduce our insurance costs, attract top-tier talent who want to work for ethical companies, and position us for international expansion in markets where environmental standards are mandatory. Harrison's confidence was visibly wavering. These are all theoretical benefits. The costs are immediate and concrete. So are the costs of continuing to hide violations, Elena said quietly. Every day you delay addressing these problems, the eventual cleanup becomes more expensive. Every day you continue operations that harm communities, you increase your legal exposure. And every day you prioritize short-term profits over long-term sustainability, you weaken your competitive position. Victor watched the faces around the room, seeing the exact moment when the tide began to turn. Robert Hayes was studying David's legal analysis with growing interest. Patricia Sterling was calculating numbers on her phone. Even Harrison seemed to be reconsidering his absolute opposition. "There's one more thing," Victor said, pulling out his phone. "I've been receiving calls all morning from environmental groups, consumer advocacy organizations, and institutional investors. Word of our audit decision has already leaked, and the response has been overwhelmingly positive." He read from his screen. The California Public Employees Retirement System announced they're considering a major investment in Ashford Industries if we follow through on environmental leadership. The European Union indicated our products could qualify for preferred trading status, and 3 major consumer brands have reached out about potential partnerships with environmentally responsible suppliers. The silence that followed was different from the previous confrontational pauses. This was the silence of minds changing, of rigid positions softening under the weight of new information. "The vote for my removal still stands," Harrison said finally, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Actually," David said, consulting his documents, "according to corporate bylaws, any CEO removal vote can be postponed for 30 days if the chief financial officer requests additional time to analyze the financial implications of pending decisions." Harrison's face darkened. "David, you can't be serious." "I'm invoking that provision," David replied firmly. "We need 30 days to properly evaluate the environmental transformation proposal before making irreversible leadership changes." Victor felt something unprecedented in his corporate experience, genuine gratitude toward colleagues who were risking their own careers to support moral principles over immediate profit. But as he looked around the room, at faces ranging from hostile to uncertain to hopeful, Victor realized that the next 30 days would determine not just the fate of his company, but the kind of legacy he would leave for Sophia's generation. The real battle was just beginning. 1 year later, Victor Ashford stood before the United Nations Environmental Council, but he was no longer the same man who had screamed at a housekeeping employee in his mansion. The transformation was visible in everything from his relaxed posture to the genuine warmth in his eyes as he addressed world leaders about corporate environmental responsibility. 12 months ago, Victor began, his voice carrying across the assembly hall, I was a billionaire who measured success by how much I could take from the world. Today, I'm here to tell you about a different kind of wealth, the wealth that comes from giving back. In the audience, Elena sat beside Sophia, who was now wearing her Columbia University student ID with pride. The scholarship Victor had promised had been just the beginning. Sophia had become the youngest environmental policy intern in the university's history, her passion channeled into real change. The Ashford Environmental Initiative has exceeded every projection, Victor continued. Our voluntary cleanup efforts have restored 3 major watersheds. Our transition to renewable energy has created 12,000 new jobs. And our transparent reporting standards have become the industry benchmark that competitors are scrambling to match. But the numbers weren't what made Victor's voice crack with emotion. It was the letter he pulled from his pocket, handwritten by an 8-year-old girl whose neighborhood had been transformed by his company's environmental restoration. "Dear Mr. Ashford," he read aloud, "thank you for making our river clean again. My mom says I can swim in it when I'm older. You're a hero like Superman, but real." The assembly erupted in spontaneous applause, but Victor's eyes found Eleanor in the crowd. She was crying, not with sadness, but with the profound joy of witnessing redemption fulfilled. Margaret, now director of the Ashford Foundation for Environmental Justice, approached the podium with a final surprise. "Mr. Ashford, there's someone here who wanted to thank you personally." An elderly man stepped forward. Miguel Martinez, the engineer whose family Sophia had mentioned in that life-changing cafe conversation. He now served as senior environmental advisor at Ashford Industries, leading the same cleanup efforts that had once seemed impossible. "Victor," Miguel said, his voice strong despite his tears, "you didn't just give me back my job. You gave me back my faith in humanity." Udin, as the ceremony concluded, Victor found himself surrounded by the people who had become his true family. Eleanor, whose quiet courage had sparked everything. Sophia, whose passionate idealism had shown him a better path. Margaret, who had rediscovered her own dreams. David, who had proven that financial success and moral integrity could coexist. "So," Elena asked as they walked through the UN gardens, "any regrets about the man you used to be?" Victor considered the question seriously. His net worth had actually increased through ethical business practices, but more importantly, he slept peacefully every night. His relationships were built on respect rather than fear. His legacy would be measured in lives improved rather than competitors destroyed. "Only one regret," Victor replied, taking Elena's hand in his, "that it took me 52 years to learn what you taught me in 5 minutes. "And what was that?" Victor smiled, remembering the words that had shattered his world and rebuilt his soul. "That true power isn't about silencing others. It's about amplifying their voices. That real wealth isn't what you accumulate, but what you share. And that the only success worth achieving is success that makes the world better for everyone." As the sun set over New York City, Victor Ashford, former corporate tyrant, current environmental champion, and forever student of human dignity, walked into a future where his wealth served humanity rather than enslaving it. The maid had indeed answered something unexpected when he tried to silence her. She had answered with truth, and truth, Victor had learned, was the only key that could unlock a genuinely golden life.